Steve Hegedus. Steve Hegedus is a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Delaware, and he has a dual role. He's a senior scientist at the Institute of Energy Conversion, which I believe, if its website's claim is correct, the oldest dedicated solar research institute in the land, older than Enroll, all that stuff. Steve, so one of the joys for me in working in this field is that you get to rub shoulders with I call it the first generation of solar advocates. And Steve is very much one of those. I looked through his Google Scholar list. First paper, 1984. It was cited as recently as June of last year on thin film, cadmium sulfide, the photo response of cadmium sulfide. I came across Steve recently as I've been focusing on policy in Delaware. Steve said to me when I invited him to speak here, over time he has started to realize the importance of policy on what he really wants, which is to get solar out to the world and a renewable future. He's been very active in policy circles in general in the state of Delaware, and most recently he led the Governor's Advisory Council on grid modernization. So Steve is here to share what he knows and thinks about.
Hey, good morning. Yes, you'll find out that what I'm going to be talking about today has some dovetails nicely with some of the things that Lyle was just talking about. Yeah, so I've been in PV for over 40 years. I was the first resident of Newark, Delaware, to have solar on their house back in 2007. And about 8 years ago, I realized doing stuff in the lab isn't necessary as much anymore. We got to get more integrated onto the grid and solve a lot of those problems. So I've transitioned much more to working with smart inverters, grid integration, batteries, and that sort of thing. What I'm going to be talking to you about today, what I was asked to talk about, was some of the grid modernization efforts that have been going on in Delaware. I'll go through those slides relatively quickly, and there's a lot of, mostly their text. And then I'll talk to you specifically about some of the recommendations that we've recently made, like last month, to the Governor's Energy Advisory Council, and then some of my favorite grid modernization topics and where they are and where why we need to be implementing them even more. And just to be clear, I'm not representing the University of Delaware or the Governor's Energy Council. I'm representing the grid modernization working. Okay, so this Energy Council was briefly activated back in 2010. Then we had a change in governors. I was not on it then. And then it was reactivated just last year. We've had a very active and robust energy stakeholders group that has been formed under the leadership of our Senator Stephanie Hansen. She's the chair of our Energy and Transportation Committee in the state legislature. And so a lot of the same players, like probably 80-90%, are from the stakeholder group, are also in the Governor's Energy Advisory Council. And there's a list of all the different categories that are in there. Your BPU is our PSC, Public Service Commission. We've got the utilities, and one of the interesting things in Delaware is that we've got Delmarva Power and Light, DP&L, which is a regulated utility. They're about 2/3 of the load. And then we have a co-op in southern Delaware and a group of the municipals, which makes up the other third of load. And they are not regulated, which introduces issues. And then we've got some academics and industry groups and advocates ranging from the Sierra Club to the Cesar Rodney Institute, a very libertarian organization. So the responsibilities of this Governor's Energy Advisory Council is to provide recommendations from all these experts to the State Energy Office, which is housed within DENREC, the Natural Resources and Conservation Group, who will then turn these into policies and regulations or legislation to attain those goals. And we're going to do this every 5 years, but we don't disappear for the 4 years in between. We continue to advise the state, meet regularly on updating them on what's going on nationwide in terms of energy. So the 4 working groups are renewable energy and clean technology, energy efficiency and electrification, grid modernization, of which I'm the chair, and environmental justice and energy equity. So the renewable energy and grid modernization have a lot of overlap, a lot of similar issues, and the energy efficiency and electrification has a lot of overlap with the energy justice and energy equity groups. So over the last year we've had many meetings, 3-4 hours, and we finally ended up with a set of, each working group ended up with a set of recommendations, which we then voted on internally, and then those go to the whole council, and then they got voted on. And I'll say everyone that was introduced was passed. But just to give you an idea of the flavor of the different topics that we covered in the grid modernization working group, the recommendations covered, infrastructure, reliability, cybersecurity, microgrids, storage. Now you might look at it and say, oh, well, there was only one recommendation on storage. Well, there was a recommendation under time of use, or electric rate design and time of use. That was to come up with rates that incentivize storage. There were infrastructure recommendations that had to do with both standalone and PV-tied storage. So there's a lot of overlap even within those categories. And of course, workforce development is a big concern. So I'll give you just a couple of examples of some of these grid modernization recommendations. So under the area of infrastructure, one of them was to study and evaluate the state's distribution grid and identify opportunities for battery storage and microgrids in particular, and establish a baseline of where we are and what we need in the future to implement them, and in terms of infrastructure investment. Another example was and this is one where we merged 2 different ones. First, do a study of the benefits and barriers to what's called DERMS, Distributed Energy Resource Management Systems, an industry, utility industry acronym, which would allow much more penetration of solar by having some kind of coordinated hierarchical control of the inverters. And I'll get into that more later on. And then, once you do that study, come up with a plan to identify resources to incentivize this, because these are expensive propositions for the utilities or some other aggregator to come up with. And by the way, virtual power plants are exactly require a DERMS approach. Under cost and incentives, one of them was, this is something that was just talked about, the situation where like if you have a feeder circuit that has a 10 megawatt capacity and there's an 8 megawatt solar project that applies for interconnection, it gets approved. If somebody comes along with a 3 megawatt project, a minute after that, they say, well, you're responsible for upgrading the substation or the wiring or whatever was causing the limitation. So as Lyle said, that introduces a lot of uncertainty and limitations of further hosting capacity. So look at other strategies to, and he covered the idea of socializing the costs. There's other strategies where every developer might, for example, pay into upgrading, even though their project isn't the one that pushed it over the limit. And developers would prefer certainty to uncertainty. So that's one of the things that we recommended to look at. In terms of microgrids, a lot of interest in them. This was again one where we merged different approaches. So do a study. Well, actually, I already did a study for the state several years ago on microgrids to look at the barriers. I developed goals and incentives for installing and operating a couple of microgrids within the state, maybe dedicated, maybe on state for state loads, maybe behind the meter or in front of the meter. And then encourage value stacking, which I'll have a slide which describes that in more detail, to really capture the full economic benefit of the microgrids, not just their ability to provide resilient backup power. And, for example, they may defer a distribution upgrade or meet electric vehicle charging or provide frequency stabilization. So looking at all of that, that was another recommendation. And then storage, we encourage looking at pilot deployment of different battery technology and at different scales, both residential and commercial or utility scale, both standalone and PV tied. So a couple of challenges that were identified in terms of all of the working groups that we found, not just the grid modernization, was something that I mentioned earlier. We've got one regulated utility, and yeah, they're 2/3 of the load in the state, but there still leaves the other third that is essentially unregulated, and it's difficult. We for years the State Public Service Commission passes regulations or approves regulations that apply to Delmarva Power, but they have wording that says that that other electric service providers are encouraged to come up with a comparable program, like a green incentive program, for example. But it always creates this tension between what we can do in the state in terms of policy and regulation that applies uniformly to all electric customers or service providers. Another challenge that we have is that the public advocate in Delaware, their mission is to advocate for the lowest reasonable rates for consumers consistent with adequate utility service. Well, that doesn't leave a lot of room for supporting grid modernization or some of the other concepts that were being talked about, energy equity and that sort of thing. The public advocate is very supportive of these things. I just organized a meeting with her and a bunch of other stakeholders last month about this very issue. And they're very supportive. They would like to do more to encourage this and to not have to oppose some of these concepts because they violate their fundamental mission. Pilot projects, for example, was mentioned. If we can rate base a pilot project, then that's great. But if you can't, then the public advocate then has to say, well, is this rate basing consistent with the lowest reasonable rate for consumers and maintaining adequate service? So that's a tension that we have to resolve, and it may require a change to the legislation. And all of us felt that limited workforce is also an issue that we have to deal with, and this is both at the trade school, the community college level, and the university level. Okay, so now I'd like to get to a couple of areas of my views, critical topics that are necessary for grid modernization. I've picked three. One of them is value stacking to incentivize batteries and microgrids. Another one's implementing smart inverter volt-VAR controls, which Lyle just talked about, and then coordinated control concept. So this slide, or this diagram, came from a study that was done, Portland Gas and Electric, PGE, in 2015. They built a community microgrid. They had a large battery that was installed as part of that microgrid, but not primarily to provide backup power. It was primarily to provide other services, grid services. So you'll notice it has a very high power to energy ratio, almost the opposite of what you would do if you were trying to build a battery for, a couple hours, backup storage. And what this diagram shows is see that. It's looking at the hours of the year. This pie chart is the hours of the year that it was spent doing various grid support services. And I highlighted there, doing energy arbitrage, storing when the energy was cheap and selling when the energy is high, was 1,200 hours of the year, and it earned them 12% of the total value. On the other hand, frequency response is very lucrative. They spent only 17 hours a year doing frequency response support, and they earned 56% of the revenue of the battery from doing that. So this is very short term. You're literally doing this for seconds or minutes, but it's extremely lucrative. And PJM allows you to bid into their frequency frequency response market. So this is another value you can add to a battery system if you set it up correctly. It makes the battery more cost effective. Another thing important to think about is, how do we justify microgrids for resilience? If it's going to sit there unused like a diesel generator 99.999% of the time until the grid goes out, that's a really hard expense to justify. So, if your backup generator cost there is that, let's say that amount, and then a microgrid life cycle cost is significantly greater than that, how do you justify that? Well, you got to do value stacking. So the first thing you might do is you look at, well, what's the avoided costs during an outage? And that might be difficult to quantify, but it could be things like you lost customers, or you lost food if you're a grocery store. If it's a hospital, you might lose lives even. So you have to figure out ways of monetizing that. And then you also look at, well, what's my reduced kilowatt hours? Because I'm going to be generating a lot of my own energy. So during the day, I'm going to be saving some of my energy bill. I'm also going to be reducing my kilowatt peak charges, because my battery is going to be used for me to offset not just storing energy for in case the grid goes down, but I'm going to be using it every day to moderate my energy, my demand. You also can take advantage of green incentives if you have solar, and then you're avoiding some of your generator maintenance and fuel costs. And then finally, you can sell some of these ancillary services like the frequency response or firm power. You can sell those to the grid. And now, when you finish that, your costs are, or your benefits are greater than your costs. So now this microgrid pencils out because you're taking advantage of all of these other values that are available if you have the infrastructure of a microgrid. Now this is if it's behind the meter. You could envision a similar graph if it was in front of the meter, namely if the utility owned and managed the microgrid. So there might be things like avoiding a substation upgrade, or avoiding having to reconductor along a set of distribution lines because I'm going to build a microgrid where there's going to be a new electric vehicle charging station set up. Another thing that is essential for grid modernization is what Lyle also referenced, is using the smart inverter controls that are already on inverters. And I'd like to make the analogy that if you wanted to make phone calls and you bought one of these things and you used it for a couple years to make phone calls, and then somebody said to you, oh, did you know that you could also check the weather, send texts, take pictures with that, and all those features were already built in? Oh, no, I didn't know that. Well, that's where we are today. We've been installing inverters that have volt bar, power factor, volt watt, ramp up and ramp down control for several years. These features are baked into the inverters that we've been installing, but we don't use them. Those could significantly enhance the amount of PV that we can install without running into voltage, over voltage, for example. And you can either program them so that they come pre-programmed with certain standard curves, which I'll show in a minute, and then that allows them to operate autonomously. They just respond to the frequency and the voltage on the grid, and they respond depending on whether you enable volt var or volt watt controls, or they can be controlled with a coordinated control remotely using something like a DERMS type system or coordinated control, and they're really key to increasing the hosting capacity. But I have 3 different inverters in my lab. My students and I work on trying to understand how these controls work and interact with the grid, and I'll tell you, every one of them's different. They all meet the same IEEE standards. Working with them is quite an investment in time and learning curve, so they don't make it real easy to implement some of these features. But once you learn how to do one, if you're an installer, you're going to be able to use that brand, and you'll know how to program them and activate those controls for all the rest of the ones that you install. So here's an example from a study that was done here in New Jersey 10 years ago by PEPCO. This was funded by Department of Energy, and what they were looking at was there was a PV customer that had about a 1.9 megawatt PV system 5 miles away from a substation and with a very low load on that line. And they caused significant overvoltage events when the inverter output was near its maximum, and especially on weekends in the spring when the load was low. Over 5% of the time they had overvoltage. So the utility looked at a whole bunch of solutions, and by far and away the cheapest one was just, hey, reduce the power factor to 0.96 and 0.96 injecting, absorbing, and so it would absorb some reactive power, and it brought it down so that they had hardly any overvoltage situations after that, which literally just required changing an electronic command on the inverter. So it's a perfect example of how these smart inverter controls can help integrate more solar onto the grid. These are the 2 curves that are the standards. This is the volt watt curve and the volt var curve. What they're showing on the x-axis in both of them is the voltage, line voltage. And in the top curve, that's showing that, well, when the voltage is low, you inject reactive power according to that curve. And there's a dead band. If the voltage is, let's say, within a couple percent of normal, you don't do anything. And if it starts going below that, then you start increasing the amount of VARs that you inject. Similarly, if the voltage is high, because you've got a lot of PV on that line, you start absorbing VARs. And that's the way that you can overcome some of these voltage violations, which then currently utilities say, no, you can't install solar there because it's going to cause overvoltages. And yet, very few states require these controls to be implemented. I mentioned that Massachusetts does. You can see there the gray means there's no action. This chart is from 2023. So a lot of states have some bills or some investigations going on at the state level about what to specify and how to require these controls to be implemented. It's very technical, and but the thing is, it doesn't require any additional cost. These controls are already in the inverters that we are installing today. The last topic, coordinated voltage control for feeders. I was part of a study, it was funded by Department of Energy. It just ended last year. PEPCO was involved in that to enhance the hosting capacity on a couple of distribution feeders in Maryland. And the one that I'll highlight here, they had a peak load of 13 megawatts and currently a PV fraction of 17%. And so we did a combination of simulation, which is what I'll talk about here. My lab did the hardware part where we actually looked at the smart inverters and their controls and figured out what was the right slopes of those curves that I showed you and that sort of thing. And so currently on that distribution grid, there was a substation with a load tap change. There were a voltage regulator and there were 3 capacitor banks. And what we looked at was just letting them do their thing, putting them under coordinated control, and putting them under coordinated control and using smart inverter reactive power. And what we found was that right now, existing PV penetration was 17%. By using the default controls of those utility devices, we could get up to 55%. Using a coordinated control approach managed by the utility, they could get up to 200% PV capacity, hosting capacity on that feeder. And then if you implement the reactive power factor control, or absorption of 0.95, you could get up to 250%. So that's with a coordinated control approach. And then the last thing I'll mention, because this also was highlighted by Lyle, in southern Delaware, almost the entire, which is managed by the Delaware Electric Co-op, almost the entire area is red, namely off limits for solar, because a few days a year in the spring, they get reverse power flow through some substations. And so I'm working on a project with them, also funded by Department of Energy, to install some load control, inverter switching to basically just curtail, turn off those inverters for a short period of time. You know, maybe it's hours on a few weekends in the spring, for right now at least, and that will open up a huge amount of that territory for solar. So it's a coordinated control approach because the utility is going to determine when those switches should be closed and the inverters taken offline. And in return for participating, the customers get a certain small rebate. But the biggest rebate is that they get to put solar on because right now they couldn't. So there's a lot of technological and policy-related things that have to dovetail to work, but there's a lot of promise, and there's a lot of stuff that is being done at pilot scales around the country in terms of modernizing the grid so that we can essentially install more solar and meet the growing demand from electric vehicles and electrification. Thank you.